Of all the apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary, none has so captivated the world as her appearance to 3 children at Fatima in Portugal in 1917. The 3 children were Lucia dos Santos and her cousins Jacinta and Francisco Marto. They were poor and had little education. Yet one day, while they were tending sheep, they found themselves conversing with an angel. The angel taught them how to grow in their practice of prayer, and he encouraged them to make sacrifices. He seemed to be preparing them for some great task. The nature of that task became clearer on May 13th of that year, when the children were visited by a lady who was luminous, brighter than the sun, they said, with a light that was purer than crystal. Her message to the children was much like the message they heard from the angel. She urged them to pray and do penance. The children agreed among themselves not to tell anyone about their heavenly visitors. But Jacinta let slip with her mother, and soon, well, the whole village knew. Then word spread beyond the village. Crowds began to gather around the children on the 13th day of each month, the day the lady regularly appeared. Portugal, like many countries during that time, was experiencing a heavy-handed wave of secularization. Revolutionary movements throughout Europe sought to weaken the church's influence, and they did this through law, propaganda, and even state-sponsored bullying. As reports of the apparitions went abroad, well, local officials were embarrassed. They forced the children to undergo harsh interrogations and even jailed them for a time. The local clergy were hardly more supportive, and many people feared that the apparitions were a hoax perpetrated by one or another political party. On the 13th day of one month, the clergy worked with the civil authorities to actually hijack the children on their way to the place where they customarily saw the lady. But no one could deny the change that was taking place in the lives of Lucia, Jacinta, and Francisco. They got serious about prayer, and they undertook severe fasting and other traditional means of penance. They imposed spiritual order and discipline on their daily life. So their personal conversion made their witness credible to the world. And indeed, the world was taking notice. American and European newspapers stationed reporters in Fatima to track the progress of the story. The apparitions even made it to the front pages of the faraway New York Times. Now, the details of the story were sometimes sensational, but they were true. The lady had given the children certain messages they could share with the world, and others they were to keep secret. Now, speculation ran wild about the content of the 3 secrets, which were gradually divulged over the next 83 years. What are the secrets of Fatima? The first was a vision of hell, which inspired the children to greater penance for the conversion of sinners. The second secret was about evangelization. The Blessed Virgin called for the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart and asked Catholics to make a communion of reparation on the first Saturday of every month. Now, the third secret was kept under wraps until the turn of the millennium. It included an apocalyptic vision of history as it was about to unfold. Pope Benedict XVI said it was primarily about the suffering of the Church. Its message, then, is perennial as much as it was particular. When asked about the hidden secret of Fatima, Pope St. John Paul II would take out his own rosary and tell people that this is the secret of Fatima. The visionaries at Fatima foresaw the great trials of the 20th century, like the rise of communism and the horrors of the world wars. But their secret is still relevant, and it's there in plain sight. It's prayer. It's the way we draw close to Jesus in the mysteries of the Rosary.
Welcome back to the Bible and the Virgin Mary. Over the past few sessions, we've seen a portrait of Mary painted in words by the authors of the New Testament. And that portrait depicts Mary as the new Eve, the Ark of the New Covenant, and the new Queen Mother. We've also seen how that biblical portrait gave rise to official Catholic teachings about Mary. And so far, we've looked at the scriptural basis for two of those Marian dogmas: Mary's perpetual virginity and Mary's title, Mother of God. Now we're going to examine the biblical basis for Mary's Immaculate Conception, which just so happens to be one of the most misunderstood and most contested of the Marian dogmas.
To start with, we need to be clear about just what exactly the dogma of the Immaculate Conception is. I mean, it's not, as many people think, the same thing as the virgin birth. The Immaculate Conception has nothing to do with how Mary conceived Jesus. Rather, it's about how Mary herself was conceived. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception states that Jesus' mother, alone among the billions of human persons born since the beginning of the world, was conceived without inheriting the curse of Adam and Eve's fall. In God's plan and by His grace, Mary was kept free from sin from the moment of her conception until the end of her earthly life. And not only was she free from sin, but she was also free from concupiscence, the disordered desires which lead to sin. Through the Immaculate Conception, God ensured that Mary's feelings and desires were always rightly ordered. Catholics have believed all that since the earliest days of the Church. Among others, St. Ephrem of Syria and St. Ambrose of Milan wrote about it in the 4th century. St. Augustine wrote about it in the 5th, saying that it would be an offense against Jesus to say that his mother was a sinner. St. Augustine went on to say, "All have sinned except the Holy Virgin Mary, concerning whom, for the honor of the Lord, I wish no question to be raised at all when we are treating of sins. After all, how do we know what greater degree of grace for a complete victory over sin was conferred on her who merited to conceive and bring forth him who all admit was without sin?" Let me share what another famous figure in church history said about the Immaculate Conception. "God has formed the soul and body of the Virgin Mary full of the Holy Spirit, so that she is without all sins, for she has conceived and borne the Lord Jesus." Elsewhere, this same person stated, "All seed except Mary was vitiated or corrupted by original sin." Who made these statements? None other than the father of Protestantism himself, Martin Luther. Although the Church's saints and doctors have written about Mary's Immaculate Conception for centuries, the teaching didn't become an official dogma until 1854. On December 8th of that year, Pope Pius IX declared the teaching in a document entitled Ineffabilis Deus, which means the ineffable God. In that document, the Pope noted the long history of the Church's belief that Mary was unstained by original sin. And that belief, he pointed out, had been expressed in the writings of the popes and saints, as well as in the Church's prayer and worship. He also pointed out that this belief was founded on 3 passages from the Bible, passages with which we've already become familiar. The first gospel in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3:15, the Annunciation in Luke chapter 1, and the vision of the woman in Revelation 12. Each of those passages gives us greater insight into Mary's Immaculate Conception. And when they're looked at through the prism of the Church's teaching about the Immaculate Conception, we can see even more deeply into the mystery of God's plan. Let's first use that prism to look at the passage from Genesis. Remember how when God punished Adam and Eve, he also proclaimed what the Church Fathers called the Proto-Evangelium, or First Gospel.
"I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel."
Essentially, that first gospel was the inaugural announcement of the salvation that would come from a woman and her offspring. In that first gospel, God promised that there would be perpetual enmity between this woman and the serpent. He also promised that enmity would culminate in the crushing of the serpent's head by the woman's offspring. Now, it's really important to understand what enmity means. Enmity doesn't mean mutual dislike. It doesn't even mean mutual distrust. Enmity means mutual hatred. It means the total and complete opposition of two parties. I mean, we're talking Dallas Cowboys and Pittsburgh Steelers here. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word translated as enmity implies a mortal rivalry which causes each party to desire, and usually seek, the death of the other. We see the word used that way, for example, in Numbers 35:21, Ezekiel 25:15, and Ezekiel 35:5. Now, as we saw in Lesson 3, if the seed of the woman is Jesus, that makes Mary the woman. And in Genesis 3:15, the enmity between the woman and the serpent is identical to that between their offspring. God said, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed." In other words, Mary and Jesus share the same complete opposition, the same enmity with the serpent. This is why we saw in Lesson 4, the woman and her offspring, Mary and Jesus, both at war with the serpent in Revelation 12. In order to clearly see the connection between Genesis 3:15 and the Church's dogma of the Immaculate Conception, there are two more pieces of the puzzle we need to note. First, it's important to recognize that it's God who establishes the enmity. I will put enmity. What that tells us is that this enmity is no natural aversion. It's a divinely created opposition, one that God has established for all time. Again, it's important to remember that this enmity is twofold. It's between the serpent and the woman, and between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring. In Hebrew, the word offspring literally means seed. Elsewhere, the Hebrew word is used to refer to the seed of plants, the children of individuals, and to a person's descendants or a race of people. Occasionally, the word is used in a moral sense, as when the psalmist speaks of the children of the wicked, or like when the prophet Isaiah speaks of the offspring of evildoers, sons who deal corruptly. The seed talked about in Genesis 3:15 is, of course, no ordinary seed. It has a very specific task: to crush the head of the serpent, to kill it. Now, after God promises a Redeemer who will crush the serpent, he tells Adam and Eve what their punishment will be.
To the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return."
That punishment, unfortunately, doesn't just apply to Adam and Eve. It applies to all men and women. Remember, Eve is described in Genesis 3:20 as the mother of all the living. As the human race's first mother, she passed on her sin and Adam's sin to all of her offspring. So it's an inherited part of human nature. That means what the psalmist said of himself in Psalm 51:5 can be said of you, me, and the entire human race. "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Again, we don't just share in Adam and Eve's sin, we also share in the consequences. That means all humans are under the power of death.
Therefore, as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all men sinned.
But the Proto-Evangelium also seems to envision at least two people, the woman and her offspring, to whom those words from Romans will not apply. Those two people will not be conceived under the rule of the serpent and the consequences of the serpent's deceit. Remember what the text says. The enmity between the woman and the serpent will be put there by God. And it's enmity that he puts there. It's not dislike, not distrust, but enmity. The woman and the serpent will be engaged in a mortal rivalry. Between the two, there will be absolute hostility, a hatred that implies a struggle to the death. So ask yourself this: how could Mary live in absolute opposition to the serpent, the devil, and still be under his power? No, she couldn't. If Mary was conceived with original sin, there couldn't be the perpetual enmity promised by God between the woman and the serpent. To the contrary, if Mary were conceived with original sin, the serpent would have already won. It's game over. She would have been subject to his power, and God's promise would have been false. Now, we know that God doesn't make false promises. And as Mary is clearly the mother of the one who crushes Satan, the woman promised to the world when man fell, she must have been born outside of Satan's power, just as her son was. As St. Paul noted, for the sake of our salvation, God caused grace to overflow. He also caused Jesus, who knew no sin, to reign over the power of sin and death. If the woman's seed, Jesus, was not to know sin, how could his mother? Well, the answer is that she couldn't. She had to have been conceived free from sin, because that's the only way that God's promise of enmity between the woman of Genesis 3:15 and the serpent can be consistently understood. And that's the way the church, both yesterday and today, has interpreted that passage. In his Wednesday catechesis from May 29, 1996, Mary's enmity towards Satan was absolute. Pope John Paul II explained, "The absolute hostility put between the woman and the devil thus demands in Mary the Immaculate Conception, that is, a total absence of sin from the very beginning of her life. The Son of Mary won the definitive victory over Satan and enabled his mother to receive its benefits in advance by preserving her from sin. As a result," said the Holy Father, "the Son granted her the power to resist the devil, thus achieving in the mystery of the Immaculate Conception the most notable effect of his redeeming work." Together, Genesis 3:15 and Revelation 12 give good evidence that supports the Church's teaching of Mary's Immaculate Conception. So too does the Annunciation scene in Luke's Gospel. In fact, evidence of Mary's sinless state exists in the very first sentence of that account.
And he came to her and said, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with you."
Now that's a greeting found nowhere else in Scripture. The word that's translated as favored one or full of grace is kakeratomene, a form of the verb karitoo. Now that verb is an extremely rare word, used only in the Annunciation scene and in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And in each case, the verb indicates an action that causes some effect in the object of the verb. And in Luke, the term is used in the perfect tense. This means that the angel is saying he finds Mary in an already graced state. She is full of grace. In the other place we see this verb, Ephesians 1:6 and 7, Paul speaks of how God granted or bestowed his grace upon us in Jesus. And the character of this grace, this karitoo, is that of sanctifying grace. It's the kind of grace we receive through the sacraments. That's the kind of grace that leads us to holiness. In Ephesians, Paul uses the word to describe how God's grace causes a transformation in us. So it brings about the forgiveness of sins and makes us his adopted sons and daughters. But in Luke, the tense of this verb in the angel's address implies that Mary has already been favored by the bestowal of God's grace. She has already been graced and continues to be full of grace.
Now, isn't this great stuff? all the pieces are coming together, and I can't wait for the next session when we're going to examine the importance of the way that Gabriel addresses Mary and discuss the rationale for the Immaculate Conception in God's plan. In other words, why did he do it this way? We'll also answer some of the common objections often made by non-Catholics against this important dogma of the Church. And until then, God bless you.